Here's a short story inspired by the title. Top HFY stories, humans, adorably fearsome. Captain Yalthra flicked her antennae in exasperation as she studied the latest human report. The Galactic Union had reluctantly accepted them as a member species a mere decade ago, and ever since, the Union database had been flooded with increasingly bizarre and contradictory data about their behaviors. They're impossible to classify, Yalthra muttered to her second-in-command, Yorkal, a stocky Vrixian with bright yellow scales. Yorkal tilted his head. How so, Captain? They're merely another bipedal species with mammalian tendencies, yes? Read this, Yalthra said, sliding the datapad over. Yorkal skimmed the report, his scales darkened in confusion. A human bonded with a 30-ton predator on Tikrin 4. The report says they named it Fluffy and convinced it to chase after spherical projectiles for entertainment. Is that normal? Yalthra sighed. Keep reading. Yorkal scrolled further, his eyes widened. A human engineer patched a reactor leak with what? Adhesive strips and a piece of clothing, and it worked? Yalthra nodded grimly. That's what I mean. One moment, they're making primitive friendship bracelets and sharing their absurdly sugary foods with alien diplomats, and the next, they're neutralizing threats that would annihilate entire fleets using sheer audacity and something called duct tape. Yorkal frowned. Adorable, but terrifying. Exactly. Yalthra leaned back in her chair. They're creatures of paradox. They cuddle with apex predators and laugh in the face of lethal danger. It's no wonder half the Union sees them as harmless pets while the other half sees them as existential threats. Just as Yorkal was about to reply, the ship's comms lit up. Captain, you need to see this, said a nervous-looking ensign. The view screen blinked on, showing the human delegation on the surface below. A towering, heavily armored creature, undoubtedly a native predator, stood inches from a human diplomat. The alien roared, bearing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The human paused, tilted their head, and then calmly reached out. Who's a good boy? Who's a good little murder beast? The predator blinked, utterly confused. The human scratched its chin. Seconds later, the creature collapsed onto its back, wagging its tail. Yorkal gawked. They tamed it, just like that. Yalthra pinched the bridge of her nose. Add another report to the database. Title it, Humans, Adorably Fearsome. What do you think? Should I expand or adjust any part? Here's what happens next. The human diplomat, still crouched next to the now docile predator, waved enthusiastically toward the ship's cameras. All good down here, we'll call him Sparky. Yorkal glanced at Yalthra, his scales a pale yellow of disbelief. They're naming it? Before Yalthra could respond, the human tapped a device on their wrist. Captain, Sparky here says the others in the pack are kinda grumpy, might want to hold off sending reinforcements until we, vibe with them. Vibe? Yalthra repeated, her antennae twitching. What does that even mean in this context? The human grinned. It means we're gonna bring them some snacks and see if they're into belly rubs too. Pretty sure they just need to feel included. Yorkal leaned in closer to Yalthra and whispered, do they realize these others could tear through our landing teams like dried leaves? Yalthra sighed, her frustration mounting. No, Commander, I doubt they do, and that's precisely the problem. They operate under the assumption that everything in the universe is either a friend waiting to happen or a puzzle they can solve. Isn't that dangerous? Yalthra gave him a pointed look, terrifyingly so. Down on the planet, the human diplomat opened a rucksack and began tossing out small, brightly colored packets of something. Within moments, a pack of the massive predators emerged from the tree line, sniffing the air suspiciously. Come on, big guys, try some jerky, the human coaxed. The crew watched in stunned silence as the predators cautiously approached, snatched the food, and then, one by one, lowered themselves to the ground, tails wagging like oversized canines. Unbelievable, Yorkal muttered. Not unbelievable, Yalthra corrected, her voice laced with resignation. Unpredictable. She gestured at the view screen. This is why humans will forever confound the Union. They're cute as a weapon. Their sheer lack of self-preservation instinct somehow becomes a strategy. The comms crackled again. Captain, the human's voice was cheerful. Looks like we're good here. Sparky and the pack agreed to guide us through the mountain pass. Easy peasy. Yalthra shook her head. Return to the ship before you convince them to move in with you, Ambassador. On it. As the screen flicked off, Yorkal slumped into a chair, his scales darkening with stress. Captain, are we certain bringing humans into the Union wasn't a mistake? Yalthra considered this for a long moment before responding. Perhaps, but if nothing else, they'll keep our stories interesting. Want me to keep going or shift gears? As the human ambassador and their new predator companions boarded the shuttle back to the ship, the crew braced themselves for the inevitable chaos. The landing bay doors hissed open, revealing the humans casually strolling out, followed by Sparky and the rest of the pack. Everyone, meet my new friends, the ambassador declared, waving a hand toward the enormous creatures now sniffing curiously at the crew. The engineering team scrambled to erect a temporary energy barrier between the landing zone and the rest of the bay, but the human waved it off. They're harmless now, just give them a bit of jerky, and they'll be your best buddies. Yalthra strode into the bay, her antennae twitching furiously. Ambassador, explain to me why you thought bringing a pack of apex predators onto my ship was a good idea. The human grinned sheepishly. They're part of the mission now, think of them as security. Who's going to mess with us when we've got Sparky and his gang on board? As if on cue, Sparky let out a deep, rumbling growl that reverberated through the bay, but his tail wagged enthusiastically. Yalthra crossed her arms. Security? These creatures could turn on us at any moment. The ambassador crouched down and scratched behind Sparky's massive ear. The beast let out a pleased rumble, leaning into the touch. Not a chance. They're pack animals, Captain. We're their pack now. Yorkal, standing cautiously behind the captain, hissed under his breath. This is madness, absolute madness. Madness, Yalthra agreed, her voice low, but it's working. Just then, a klaxon blared throughout the ship. Captain, we're picking up an unknown vessel on the long-range scanners, the comm officer reported. It's approaching fast. Yalthra straightened. All hands to battle stations. Ambassador, get your pets secured. The ambassador didn't move. Instead, they stood up, a spark of excitement in their eyes. Actually, this might be a perfect test run for Sparky and the crew. Absolutely not, Yalthra snapped. But the human was already activating their comm. Engineering, can you rig a boarding tube from the bay to the incoming vessel? Ambassador, I forbid this. You said we were unpredictable, Captain. The ambassador interrupted with a grin. Time to prove you right. Minutes later, Sparky and the pack were outfitted with makeshift armor cobbled together from spare plating and a liberal application of duct tape. The predators, surprisingly compliant, seemed to revel in the attention and head pats from the engineering crew. When the hostile vessel docked, its occupants, a band of notorious raiders, didn't know what hit them. As the bay doors opened, the raiders were greeted not by the usual armed guards but by a pack of enormous, snarling beasts charging at them. Leading the pack was the human ambassador, brandishing a stun baton and yelling, "Get 'em, Sparky!" The ensuing chaos was brief but decisive. Within minutes, the raiders were subdued, their weapons scattered across the floor as Sparky and his pack stood over them, wagging their tails triumphantly. Yalthra watched the security footage in stunned silence. Well, Yorkal said finally, I suppose we've learned something new about humans today. Yes, Yalthra muttered, they're not just adorably fearsome, they're a strategic nightmare. The ambassador's voice came over the comm, cheerful as ever. Captain, Sparky says we should keep one of the raiders as a pet. Thoughts? Yalthra groaned, already dreading the next report she'd have to file with the Union. Want to explore what happens next with the raiders, or something else?